So I started writing poems in my retirement, and the poems in this first pamphlet were written between 2015 and earlier this year. These were written as single poems. I didn't know that I was writing a pamphlet until last year. Having decided to enter a pamphlet competition, I looked over my work, and it was only when I put my poems alongside each other that I could see the common themes emerge. The poems also spoke to each other, perhaps helping to explain each other to the reader. And that's no great surprise, as of course they share the same author. So what emerged for me from putting this pamphlet together is that I'm writing out of my own family heritage, which happens to be a South African Ashkenazi Jewish background, Litvak on my father's side, Galiciana on my mother's. My mother, who's with us this evening, I'm so delighted to say, married beneath herself. But I'm also writing out of my own life story, which involves coming to London from South Africa at age 6, a further emigration to Glasgow in 1979, and perhaps the biggest journey, bringing a Glaswegian woman to Edinburgh in 1982. Along the way, there have been languages. The languages spoken by my grandparents, Yiddish, German, English, Afrikaans, to mention but a few. My own London education and the Glaswegian Scots, which I heard spoken in my wife's family, and latterly Spanish, which I've been learning ever since my son emigrated to Madrid. One of the challenges for a poet is to write from your own experience in a way which is tangible and persuasive, but not too boring or too obscure for those who didn't happen to know my great uncle Chaim. What I found in the writing and revising of these poems is that my own Jewish heritage is just a microcosm of the wider Ashkenazi diaspora experience of the last century. And that's also just a part of the longer Jewish historical experience. For example, through my new interest in Spain, I've learned of the tragedy of the Sephardic Jews, including the mass expulsions and forced conversions of 1492. But it doesn't end there. My own story and the whole wandering Jewish experience is part of a bigger story of human migration, settlement, expulsion over the millennia. As it happens, I was born in Cape Town, so I am from Africa. But aren't we all from Africa? Homo sapiens came out of Africa. So in one of the poems, I answer that familiar question which annoys all of us who may look or sound a little different. That question, but where are you from? With this answer, we are from Africa, like you, and we are from the stars, just like you. I'm now going to screen share and read a few of my poems, and then I will give you a bit of the background to one of my poems, which involves a sort of starring role for F. Borowski, you'll be pleased to know. Need to screen share. Bear with me. Right, can everybody see what is here? Here's my pamphlet. No. Sorry?
We cannot see the screen share.
You cannot see the screen share. Okay, thank you for letting me know that.
But let me know if you need any help.
I think, why is it not screen sharing? It's probably because I've got something else open at the same time.
Here we go. Okay, yeah, that's perfect.
How's that looking now? Let's go make it full size. Okay, all good now.
All good.
Right, and I can even see some people here. Right, sorry about that delay. So there's the cover of the pamphlet, and I'll go straight in with a few poems now. Lacquerwood Fiddler. In Red Square, grannies sweep the snow. Men with hungry eyes come on the coach, bribe our driver, pull wild cats with ear flaps from a canvas bag. In the Lennon Hills, veterans sell army caps and all their glory badges of a worthless war. I need some trophy, trinket, but I will not find you here, but posed and presented, wood freezing your anguish in the gum department store. Crudely made, you hold your fiddle in a fingerless fist and throw back your head to a pudding bowl hat. And yet your eyes are closed and ringed in concentration, and the stubble on your chin shadows a restless moon. What is your melody, my yiddle-mitten fiddle? Who inscribed I on your bass? Who carved and schlepped you from your shtetl? My friend, you need to ask. The klezmer I play for your 10 rubles is singing in your granny's voice. And I is the cry that falls from the roof of the burning barn when the Cossacks ride out in the morning. So we move straight from Moscow to the city of Cordoba, which I won't go into detail because we don't have time. I'll let the poem speak for itself. Bitter fruit ripening, the great mosque in Cordoba. Fragrance of orange blossom blows him in, Carlos, king of the world. All he surveys stands on what was built before, Roman and Visigoth columns, shod with horseshoe arches, innumerable as rows of palm trees, wood panels scented with gold, intoxication of red wine, marble in the veins, and above, stars set in a blue-tiled sky. Here at the heart of the Mezquita, a new cathedral chapel soars. Carlos contemplates his works, recoils from the intrusion, blames officials and architects, thinking, it is I who have destroyed something unique in the world. Yet time lends harmony to the inclusion, another jewel in a well-worn frame. In time, all faiths and none may pray where stones converge in bittersweet embrace. Here at home, friend, a grasping gale tears our blue flag set with stars. And as hope falls on toppled stones, another boy who dreamed he would be king observes what he has done. Spring blossoms affirm by their myriad flames that the oranges here will ripen again, and we shall make marmalade from bitter fruit. The boy here is not the boy who would be king, but my own boy. This is a 2016 in the referendum, and this is the boy who, after we lost the referendum on EU, staying in the EU, decided he was definitely emigrating to Madrid. I'm going to now read the Trebler's Tale, which is the Scots-Yiddish confection in the partly excavated but very largely reimagined dialect of Scots-Yiddish. So this is written in a language which doesn't really exist, but nonetheless, hopefully for this audience might be quite interesting and fun. And what I've got at the right-hand side of the page is a sort of a very succinct summary of the gist of each section. The Trebler's Tale. Dreg je toches vrede lochen, skreeg de ruche de mama loschen, then gepokt and gemazeld with schmutz and with smot, Scots-Yiddish mishmosh is what je he got. Misgoogled, gemischt, with achs and with ochs, a crowdy schmeared bannock and hamische locks. Nu sup je drap, nosek and hey good nosh, listen wheel to my meisa and dinner ye fash. A selkie, Struusgot, telt me this in Lumfinnens, gefilte fish, druk it and she mitten drinnen. David was a Trebler chiel, a mensch don boychik ne schlemiel. A Litvak had ne been to school, but davened at Reb Deich's shul, and on plashy Sunday nicht that Jewish lit would share new licht. David I took the stopping train, hoachin wi all the Treblin men. He'd schlepp for miles to scrape 2 shilling, and on the train would lay to filling. He schlepped his schmutter all through Fife. Wheel Kent by money a lanely wife. War Yid and Peckle war Ken Speckle in Ilka Fife and Toon and Stettel. In Hodson plots it often storn, I yammering for the promised lawn. David was from and kept the faith, frae all the swicks or shicks is safe, until thon glitch doon at some farm. A gallus henwife meant an ham, called Davy Ben, gied him a brew, which made poor David offy foo. Fashnosket, far toots and out the game, one chutzpahdik and win his shame, she stealt his gear and wouldn't he pay, his peckled tomb set on his way. David got af the Embratoon, the nicht was dreich, o Davy Doon. In dread mein Geld, ich bin verloren, verfende day, das ich geboren. Ach, I wheel, a neighbor speared, oi wees mir, ich hop, ein Geiser hied. Nu David and his lead, allang sein gain, along with Jacobs, Greenbaum, Everil came, and since Scots-Yiddish has nae gone samaka, some cry me, pisha badi, others alta kaka. I was going to interrupt myself to say that this bit of dialogue here, acha I wheel and oiveis mir ich hop in Geiser heed, is perhaps the only authentic bit of collected Scots-Yiddish, which I got from David Katz, a poet who heard this in the Gaubles sometime in maybe the 1950s. And I kind of built the whole poem around that one fragment. Where have we got to? And I think that must be the end of my screen sharing, yes. Now I need to find my document that I couldn't have on screen. Now, what I'd like to do now, and I hope F. Borowski's still with us because he comes into this, is to try to sort of explain something about what I'm trying to say, why I'm writing. It's difficult to know where to start. And eventually, after a lot of agonizing, I decided I would look at just one of the poems, El Impacto del Olvido, which means the impact of forgetting, and use that to sort of try and give an account of how I've been writing. The Olvido is a special type of forgetting as well. It can refer to the deliberate decision in post-Franco Spain to let bygones be bygones, to leave the bodies of the Civil War dead to rest undisturbed, so to speak. Though that pact is coming unstuck with exhumations, including, of course, that of Franco himself. So this poem started with an anecdote told to me by none other than Ephraim Borowski of this parish, or should I say of this shtetl. A first draft was written in 2015, and my son, who was already in Madrid at that point, where he now lives, I sent it to him. Sorry, I've lost my text here. Yes, so I was getting into Spain because my son was in Madrid. I read about the history of the Jews of Spain who were expelled or forcibly converted more than 500 years ago in 1492. Nonetheless, for centuries, the descendants of Jews continue to practice at least some of the rituals in conditions of secrecy and the ever-present threat of the Inquisition. I was discussing this with F when he told me the most extraordinary anecdote. about a young Spanish woman, a cleaner in a London house, who expressed surprise when candles were lit on a Friday night. And I relayed this in the voice of the Spanish girl in the poem. Once, cleaning in a London house, one Friday in the dusk, my boss, she set the table and she lit some candles too. You have that funny custom here. We have that back at home. My granny lights a candle just every Friday night. She does it in a cupboard though. It's something which she can't explain. And that, in a sense, is the heart of the poem, the originating anecdote. I go on to put it in context by letting the Spanish girl speak about the life of her granny. After all, this granny would have lived through the Spanish Civil War, and there would be much more recent historical experiences to remember or deliberately forget. And so I related the Pact of Oviedo, the deliberate forgetting of Civil War wounds, to the secret remembering of lighting the candles on the Sabbath. And by the way, the Spaniards still call Saturday Sabado, which is the Sabbath. Sunday is Domingo. So they're still in within the language, amazingly, after 500 years of repression of Spain's Jewish and Muslim heritage, they are still, in a sense, celebrating in the Spanish language the Jewish Sabbath. Then, as I was prematurely saying to you, I shared the poem with my son. He liked it, but he was skeptical. He challenged me about writing about a story which was not my own story to tell. We could get into a long discussion about cultural appropriation and whether a poet can write in the voice of someone from another ethnic or other heritage. It's a live discussion between poets at present. Recently, for example, I was a bit uncomfortable hearing a poem about the concentration camps, which was written and read by a non-Jewish poet. But you know what? If we want the Holocaust to be remembered and understood, surely we should welcome the telling or retelling in other voices, so long as it's done with empathy and respect. It may not be the same as when I write about my own family, but we all share a common humanity. And part of that is being able to put ourselves in the position of someone who is suffering or is celebrating, but who happens to have different characteristics or a different life story to our own. My son also challenged me to make the poem more personal. Why was the anecdote about the Spanish girl and her granny important to me? I recall the injunction in the Haggadah to tell the story of the Exodus as if it happened to me personally. And so I extended the poem, gave it another section, which explored my own feelings. I introduced a fresh anecdote, this time my own story of a moving visit to the Casa de Safarad in the Juderia, the old Jewish ghetto of Cordoba. When the guide had led us to the courtyard and sang a song in Ladino, peppered with a variety of languages of the Mediterranean, I found myself suddenly moved to tears. But why was I crying? After all, I'm an Ashkenazi, not a Sephardic Jew. My heritage language is Yiddish, not Ladino. So I spoke a little of a piece of Litvak heritage. My father's family came from Lithuania. As a boy in South Africa, he had pen friends all over the world. I recall a shoebox full of letters. In amongst them were letters from my dad's cousins in Lithuania. The postmarks stopped in 1941. The letters in the shoebox are long lost, but not really lost. It remains as an important memory, which pops up in another poem in this collection. In this poem, I put in a reference drawn from a partisan song, Still die Nacht, composed by Hirsch Glick in 1943. The song contains 3 words for a gun, reflecting the mixing of Yiddish dialects in what I describe as the Desperanto Yiddish of the camps. I conclude the poem by reflecting on my own feelings. And now, with, I hope, that bit of backstory, I will let the poem speak for itself. El impacto del olvido, the impact of forgetting. El olvido. 92, a great year, 92. Columbus set out for the west. We took Granada from the Moors. And though it was done in a dubious way, maybe it's good we've no Jews today. They mostly converted or left, so I'm told, in 1492. They're digging in my pueblo. My granny says it's best to leave the dead just where they are, to let them be, to let them rest. Always remember, she used to say. Remember, it's best to forget. 92, my granny's now, a great age, 92. She was just a girl when all those people were killed in our pueblo. She didn't say much, just forget. I couldn't find a job in Spain. You've got to travel on. I'm doing lots of different jobs until it's good back home. Once cleaning in a London house, one Friday in the dusk. My boss, she set the table and she lit some candles too. You have that funny custom here. We have that back at home. My granny lights a candle just every Friday night. She does it in a cupboard though. It's something which she can't explain. Part 2, El Impacto, the impact. This strange suburban story, why does it move me so? Hot November, Casa de Sefarad, Córdoba. Why, when the black-bearded guide sings the song of a Jewish girl in Ladino and the tongues of every foreign sailor who used her in those days in Salonika, why do I start to cry? I was not with the partisans in the forests of Lithuania, the Vilna refugees, singing all their words for a gun, Speyer, Nagan, Pistoil, in Desperanto Yiddish of the camps. I have no memories, nor pain, and the sweet ache which comes down the generations is this fond yearning for the worlds which used to be, before came 1492, before came 1943. Now, my guest poet this evening is Ellen Galford. Ellen and I are very different, but one thing which we have in common is a love and a longing for our lost language. Yiddish is usually known as the Mamaloschen, the mother tongue, though in my case, and I think for Ellen as well, it's more of a Boboloschen, the language of our grandparents. I will let Ellen speak for herself shortly, but first an anecdote which explains a little about my own relationship with Yiddish at one generation removed. This is my mother's story, which she reminded me of this morning. And she takes us back to 1937, when as a 7-year-old, she lived in the well-known, largely Jewish seaside resort of Muizenberg near Cape Town. My mother took the train every day from age 7 to age 16 from Muizenberg on the half-hour journey for 5 or 6 stops to Weinberg, where she attended primary school, and then the Weinberg Girls' High School. My grandfather accompanied her as he stayed on for the extra half-hour journey to his work in the city of Cape Town. They were also accompanied at a table for 4 by an older man, a Mr. Louis Cohen, who spoke fluent Yiddish but only broken English. My grandparents spoke a little Viennese German to each other at home, but were determined to speak English to my mother and her older sister. Imagine the scene in that railway carriage, first class, a whites-only compartment in those days. My grandfather and Mr. Cohen sit opposite my mother, and they're talking. A bit of English is spoken, but mostly Yiddish, and the conversation is exclusively in Yiddish when Mr. Cohen is boasting of his romantic liaisons, which are not for the ears of a small child. And so with these daily half-hour Yiddish immersion classes on the train every school day from 1937 to 1946, my mother gradually learned to understand Yiddish. She can speak a little, but this is a family show and you don't want to hear the Yiddish she learned on that train. When I was growing up, I heard a bit of Yiddish from my mother with some Viennese, apple strudel mittendrin. And I also heard some Yiddish from my father, as my paternal grandmother spoke an extraordinary mishmash of Yiddish, English, and Afrikaans. Perhaps something happens in such circumstances to attune a child's ears to the beauty of a mixter of languages. For certainly, when I came to write poetry, it felt only natural to throw in words and phrases in various languages which are part of my heritage or of my own life story. Now, over to Ellen Galford. I heartily recommend her autobiographical book, Yiddish Lost and Found, which struck a chord with me and is indeed one of the influences behind my own poems, which I've read this evening. Over to Ellen.
Thank you. I wouldn't call it a book. I'd call it a little ebook essay, but and it's very specific. But what I have done, David had asked me to read a wee bit of the introduction, so I've done a kind of very abridged version of it. One of these days, I said to my mother, I'm going to learn Yiddish. She gave me one of her famous, "You're crazy" looks. So who are you planning to speak it with? Everybody's gone. That was years ago, way back in the last century. Now she's gone too. And it took even more years before I found myself in the Yiddish class, turning one of these days into now. But I'm still trying to answer my mother's question. I can see why she might have felt puzzled. For a start, I didn't even live in New York anymore. Instead, I'd left the city that our family regarded as the center of the Jewish universe and emigrated to Scotland, which was anything but. I'd undermined the valiant efforts that her grandparents had made back in the 1880s to get our gene pool safely across the Atlantic. And what's worse, I'd fetched up in a place that one relative aptly described as 3,500 miles from a decent pastrami sandwich. Although Yiddish has migrated to all corners of the earth, Edinburgh is not the first place that would spring to mind as the likeliest place to learn it. Nevertheless, it has two crucial elements required for a Yiddish class: a group of people eager to learn it and a brilliant teacher to help us make this happen. Our teacher, Heather Valencia, is well known as a Yiddish scholar and translator. Her patience is more than saintly. Members of our class learn at different speeds and come with widely varying levels of prior knowledge. But we're never really alone in the room. Invisible eavesdroppers join us. Long departed relatives whose Yiddish still echoes in our ears are constantly conjured up and quoted. My late grandmother, for instance, rarely misses a class. It's just as well. I need all the ancestral help I can get. I still struggle to absorb the vocabulary, wrangle with the grammar, and attempt to write a bit of Yiddish poetry. But the more I learn, the less I feel I know. So I was surprised some years ago now, when one of my classmates, who's a far better linguist than I am, remarked upon my progress. "You've come on so well," Stephanie said, "considering the only Yiddish you started with was a bit of that awful jokey New York slang." I know she meant this as high praise, but then I felt my back begin to stiffen ever so slightly. To explain why, we need to take a small detour across a minefield. It didn't take me long as a learner to discover that some European speakers view American Yiddish with a wary eye. How would you feel, they ask, if you struggled out from the ashes of the Holocaust, only to find that the rich, poetic language that had shaped your world for 800 years was now reduced to a welter of kitsch, comic punchlines, and vulgar nicknames for certain body parts? There was a time and a place back in the last century when this had come uncomfortably close to the truth. Yiddish, in the popular imagination of your average American Jewish baby boomer, was inextricably associated with old people, along with rheumatism and Social Security payments and watching the Lawrence Welk show on TV. Like most things on the far side of any generational divide, it was viewed with mild contempt, or more likely, not thought of at all. This isn't, was it ever, the whole story, but I'm not going to make your eyes glaze over with a potted history of Yiddish's shifting fortunes. So, to return to Stephanie and her unwittingly backhanded compliment, it started me thinking about the Yiddish I'd grown up with as it was used by my large and close-knit extended family. Yes, some of it was deployed for comic effect, but it was much more complicated, much more nuanced, much more multidimensional than that. So I began to write down every Yiddish word or phrase I remembered from the very beginning of my life. A whole rush of these words hit me all at once, and then at odd moments, dozens of others trickled out one by one, mainly in the dead of night. As a matter of principle, I did not list any of the new words that I'd only encountered in our class. Instead, I limited it to my own deeply embedded old words. This was the Yiddish I knew before I learned Yiddish. Endearments, catchwords, curses and all. Some are actually Hebrew words. Others are admittedly Yinglish, which is an uneasy but lively linguistic mixed marriage. Nobody could call this an adequate vocabulary. It's barely the remnant of a remnant. But what is it about this faint echo of a mother tongue that so obsesses me? What do these words reveal about the people who use them? What do they say about the old worlds they abandoned and the new worlds they invented for themselves? About the capriciousness of memory, theirs and mine, about what lasts and what gets lost? The very fact that anything of my family's Yiddish still survives tells its own story. It might only be a shadow, but if so, it's a shadow that walks and talks and defies the laws of physics. It has a life and an energy of all its own. It's been tough enough to weather being wrenched from its roots, tenacious enough to survive 3 generations of eager assimilation and 2 transatlantic crossings in opposite directions. It holds in its sounds and its fragments the last traces of a complicated private world. It brings back the ghosts of people, some gone long before I was born, whose names and stories I somehow remember. I peer into their words as if they were windows, straining my ears to eavesdrop on old conversations. They catch me at it and draw me in. I find myself in a kitchen. It has to be a kitchen, where several generations sit around the table. They argue, tease, gossip, and unceasingly interrupt each other while drinking strong coffee from a never empty pot. Standard rules of time and mortality don't apply here. The only real ghost in the room is me. So as well as that was kind of a background, and I guess I am very Yiddish obsessed, although certainly would never claim myself, even now after years of trying, to be fluent. But my love affair with Yiddish is something that has inspired a lot of thinking, but there's also a particular poem which David seems to like too, because he's asked me to read to you. And it's called Mama Mama Loshen, which is of course for Yiddish, the mother tongue. Mama Mama Loshen wears beads of Baltic amber, a touch of French perfume, and a gun once owned by an Odessa gangster under a skirt recycled from a sage's prayer shawl. Mama Mama Loshen never leaves her kitchen, yet is never off the city streets, drifting between the study houses and the cabarets, telling jokes that were old when Babylon was young. Mama Mama Loshen has forgotten where she was born and carries 20 different passports sewn into the hem of her raincoat. Mama Mama Loshen sails the seas in a leaky lifeboat, driving off leviathans by reciting her recipes for gefilte fish and pickled herring. Mama Mama Loshen makes time for her lovers, pinching the pale cheeks of Torah scholars, infiltrating their daughters' daydreams, flirting with old socialists on May Day. Mama Mama Loshen knows more songs than the birds, more prayers than the angels, more curses than Cain, and never hesitates to tell hard truths to heaven. Mama Mama Loshen gives me the keys to her house, where 10,000 doors demand to be opened. But she changes the locks between visits if I don't come the moment she calls me. Mama Mama Loshen never stands still, wandering the worlds with her army of poets, leaving me to run stumbling in her wake, desperate not to lose sight of her altogether. And I don't know my allocated time. I've got one more short poem. I don't know if David wants me to read a second one. I don't want to be, this is his night and I don't want him to be feeling it's eroded. But I've also, this is not specifically about.
Please go for it. Go for it.
Go for it. Okay, this is a wee one. And it's in honor of my Yiddish speaking grandmother who hangs out at our Yiddish class. And it's called New Jersey Nocturne. My grandmother's snores were oratorical. Vocables, fricatives, polysyllables, strings of sound that could be someone's name, warnings, inventories, declarations, full formed into sentences, drifting into ellipse, or slammed shut by an exclamation mark. Nightly, this thunder rolled across the room, leaping the canyon between our beds, making the wallpaper morning glories tremble on their trellises. before passing through the storm windows, skiting downhill over 30,000 backyards, crossing the Jersey Turnpike and into the Meadowlands, to whirl up mosquito clouds over the rusty waters, rattle the Pulaski Skyway's iron ribs, batter through Newark Bay and the Kildan Cove, shatter dreams in Staten Island, trouble Brooklyn, then fade away to a rumble out at sea. I suppose those were Yiddish snores she was snoring.
Thanks very much, Ellen.
I was going to say thank you so much, Ellen, as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen, for sharing your work with us this evening and for adding your presence to our event. Before we go on to our Q&A, actually, I was going to ask if everyone would be all right giving a silent but visual round of applause on the screen. I'll just do it with me. If people can do it on the screen, thank you so much for both Ellen and David for doing their readings. Thank you. While I'm asking some questions, please take a few moments to think of your own. You can pop them in the chat or just indicate in the chat that you have a question, and we'll be able to give you the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask some questions. Without further ado, David, if you're ready for some questions.
I am.
So what were the main literary and other influences behind your work?
I hate that question, even though it's a question I planted. One of the things about starting to write poetry in my mid-60s is that unlike many poets of similar age who've been going for 30, 40 or more years, I haven't read all that much poetry. I did A-level English, but that was 50 years ago. But, you know, bits of Shakespeare and John Donne seem to kind of occur in my poems. So I guess, you know, the canon of English literature is somewhere there as an influence. And I'm desperately trying to catch up, and I have piles of pamphlets, you know, poetry pamphlets to read. I've even read one or two of them. But what I think is the biggest influence is actually, it's more my life. And what's moved me to write poetry is a sort of a need to express myself. Some of the poems have been written, and when I say written, I mean that kind of first explosive rough draft has been written when I've woken up at sort of 5 or 6 in the morning, having in that half awake state, having the words of a poem going round in my head, and indeed the Trebler's Tale was one such poem. So the first draft got written in a couple of hours, in a rush. You know, I didn't even make myself a cup of coffee. I just wanted to get it written. So, but an interest in Scots-Yiddish had been turning over in my mind, I think, for many years. I suppose since reading David Bleiman's autobiography, in which he talks about Scots-Yiddish as a lost language. Writing in 1957, he regrets the fact that in the 1920s and 1930s, the speakers of Scots-Yiddish had not been recorded. And Bleiman says in 1957, but it's too late now. So it was quite a challenge. You know, if it was too late in 1957, it was quite a challenge to write a poem in Scots-Yiddish in 2020. Yeah, so those kind of influences. I think I've spoken already a little bit about, you know, my own family heritage. I mean, it was quite extraordinary hearing snatches of different languages as a child. And I recall especially my paternal grandmother, Oma Ethel, coming to London in the 1960s, and I had to sort of escort her to Muswell Hill. She called it Mushwell. She had her own names for places, Leicester Square on the Underground and Mushwell. So we went to Mushwell, and she wanted to buy shoes. And she tried to speak to this shop assistant in a mixture of Yiddish, Afrikaans, and English, because that was what was spoken in Paro, where she had run Bleiman's Handy House, in the local mixed, sort of mixed race, mixed language community. So yeah, so I mean, I think this interest in writing in different languages or with a smattering of different languages came fairly naturally to me. But a lot of poets are doing this now. It's quite the thing, really, and I think a very appropriate thing. People from all kinds of backgrounds are bringing their heritage languages. And this concept of language lost and found is not just something for me or for Ellen, but you find it, for example, in people from a Caribbean or African continent background as well. The interest, and I feel in some ways, the less of your heritage language that you retain, the more important must be those words that you do retain. And I think Ellen said it has to be the kitchen. Words about food are very often the words that you remember.
Thank you. While you were talking, it prompted another question that was unplanted, so it might be a bit of a curveball. But when listening to your poetry, I felt a lot of emotional kind of chords in there, and I wondered if, kind of playing around with Scots-Yiddish, if that language kind of really lent itself to talking in a more emotional tone in your poetry.
Well, I think the emotion is what drives the need to write, and then one's got to sort of polish it a bit. The thing about Scots-Yiddish, what was really driving my interest in Scots-Yiddish, is the fact that the two languages inhabit the same sound world. They do kind of, if one looks back far enough, they do have a sort of common linguistic root. But they sound so similar, and there are even a few words which are the same, precisely the same word. But the whole sound, this kind of tochas in the lochen kind of sound, is it feels so right to to be able to speak Scots. Because if you can understand, or if you can pronounce Yiddish, you can pronounce Scots, and vice versa. You're not going to have problems with saying chutzpah or lochen, and I think that was part of the driver for me. Just a fascination with the language.
Thank you. And can you talk a bit more about the cover of your pamphlet and the artwork?
Yes, and I think we still have Tony Gilbert with us. Let me just check in the gallery. Is Tony? Yes, Tony is waving. Okay, the person waving there is Tony, or Anthony Gilbert, who designed, doesn't just design, actually produced that wonderful cover. It's interesting, some editors insist on producing the cover for a poetry book because they have their own, their own artists that they work with, or they have a kind of house style, and every pamphlet has to be produced in the house style. But I was fortunate in having a publisher who were they were quite delighted that I came along with a cover, and they liked the cover. So the cover was something which Tony produced. Tony is the sort of resident poster artist for the Edinburgh Jewish Lit. So his work is very well known, I think, probably in this audience. But mostly they're sort of line drawings, or like cartoon style. More unusual to have a full color illustration from Tony. But the thing which was rather wonderful is that Tony was very interested in meeting my needs, and he wasn't, he didn't at all insist on his kind of artistic, sensibilities, shall we say. He was happy with what I wanted, and if I wanted the fiddler to be floating above the table rather than seated at the table, Tony was happy to produce that, and so forth. But he came up with some other things that I particularly like the spilt glass of wine at the table, for example, which kind of, if it's Palwyn's, better on the tablecloth than drinking it anyway. But yeah, anyway, so I mean, it's a cover which people very much like. The colours are very bright and attractive, which might help to sell the pamphlet as well. Yeah, just wonderful to be able to collaborate with Tony on the cover.
Thank you so much. Our event will conclude with a poem recited by David. But before we go ahead, I would formally like to thank David and Ellen for presenting at tonight's event, and to thank you all for choosing to join us this evening for this poetry. Thank you, everyone. I would now like to invite David to read his closing poem.
Okay, a poet should not take himself too seriously, so I will end with a short celebration of a well-known Yiddish word. But first, my thanks to Ruby, to Melissa, to Kirsty, who couldn't join us, to Ephraim, and everyone at Skojak who have been so supportive of my recent venture into poetry. And thanks to Ellen for joining me this evening with her wonderful words. And thanks to my mother, Rita the Schwalbeler, or Little Swallow, of that rediscovered Yiddish letter written in 1931 by her granny, who's joined us this evening. A constant source of joy in my life. So, chutzpah. Chutzpah enters your house without ringing the bell, walks down the hall in muddy boots, then points out the marks on your carpet. Chutzpah won't need a thesaurus to check for synonyms for chutzpah. I think you'll find I wrote the thesaurus, explains chutzpah. Chutzpah kills his mum and dad and begs the judge for mercy. Take pity on an orphan, says chutzpah. Chutzpah chapped that anecdote from Joys of Yiddish, Leo Rosten. You'll find it on page 94. All my own work, says chutzpah. Chutzpah is flagrant, he's shameless, blows his own brazen trumpet, the trumpet you lent him. It's his now, forget it. Chutzpah's a brass-necked imposter, gate crashes the party without a bottle. That's chutzpah at the back door, slipping out with your whiskey. Chutzpah gives you free advice, then sends you an invoice, says, we must meet for dinner. When can you have me round? Chutzpah is not pronounced chutzpah, not chutzpah, and surely not shitzpah. Think lochen, think drich, then say chutzpah. Chutzpah's got a bloody nerve, self-esteem powered cheek with attitude. Chutzpah came to Scotland, put a kilt on, changed his name to Gallus, the gall of it. Thank you, everyone. A große Dank. Seid gesund.